The official record is a simple one. It is a midwife's ledger from the year 1837, its pages brittle and stained by the relentless damp of a Louisiana parish. The entry for October the 12th notes the birth of 2 female infants to Adeline Rousseau, wife of a local trapper who had died of fever just 3 months prior. It was a common enough tragedy in a place where life was as fragile as the marsh gas that hovered over the bayou. The page is unremarkable, filled with the neat looping script of a woman who had seen dozens of such entries before it. But in the margin, next to the names that were never officially given, is a second entry, written in a different hand. The ink is spidery and rushed, a mark of pure desperation. It is a single, chilling aberration in an otherwise orderly account of life and death. The final entry, the impossible revelation, does not speak of a birth at all. It says that on that night, the attending physician recorded not a delivery, but a convergence. If the forgotten voices of history call to you, and this is your first time here, consider subscribing to join our circle of archivists and keep the past within reach. The storm that broke over St. Genevieve Parish on that October night was not merely weather. It was a living thing, a malevolent entity that clawed at the cypress trees and tore at the tin roofs of the scattered settlements. Rain did not fall from the sky. It was thrown, hurled in horizontal sheets that turned the soft earth into a churning soup of mud and decay. Thunder was a constant, percussive roar that vibrated deep in the chest, the sound of mountains grinding together in a lightless sky. With each flash of lightning, the world was remade for a single, bleached white second. The familiar bayou became a landscape of skeletal trees, their moss-draped branches reaching like the arms of drowned men. The dark water of the swamp, usually placid and black, was whipped into a froth, its surface mirroring the violent chaos above. The air itself was thick, a suffocating blanket of humidity and the smells of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and ozone. It was a night when the natural order of things felt suspended, when the veil between the known world and something much, much older seemed perilously thin. Inside a small, clapboard house perched precariously at the edge of the swamp, the storm was a distant, secondary concern. Here, a different kind of violence was unfolding. The midwife, Elodie Thibodeau, was a woman in her late 50s, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience. Her hands, though chapped and worn, were steady and sure, hands that had guided more than 100 new souls into the world. She was a woman of quiet faith and deep-seated practicality who believed in poultices and prayer in equal measure. She had a habit of humming old Cajun lullabies during difficult births, a soft, melodic sound that had calmed more than one terrified young mother. But on this night, there was no song. There was only the strained silence between the sounds of a woman in labor and the relentless assault of the storm outside. The air in the small room was almost unbreathable, thick with the sense of sweat, blood, and boiling herbs. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar space seem alien and threatening. The mother, Adeline Rousseau, was a ghost in her own bed. She was a young woman, not yet 20 years of age, but fever had already carved hollows beneath her eyes and leached the color from her skin. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead. Her husband's passing had taken her spirit, and the difficult pregnancy had taken her strength. Now, in the final moments, she was delirious, her words a jumbled stream of memories and fears, spoken to a husband who was no longer there to hear them. She cried out for him between contractions, her voice a thin, reedy sound almost lost in the din of the storm. Elodie Thibodeau worked with a grim, focused intensity, her face slick with a mixture of sweat and rainwater that dripped from the leaking roof. She whispered words of encouragement. but her own heart was heavy with a sense of foreboding she could not name. The birth was not right. It felt different, older. The very air in the room seemed to crackle with a strange energy, a pressure that had nothing to do with the falling barometric readings outside. When the first cry finally came, it was not the robust, angry wail of a healthy newborn. It was a thin, sharp sound, more like the cry of a marsh bird than a human child. It cut through the roar of the thunder with an unnatural clarity. A few minutes later, a second cry joined the first, identical in its unsettling pitch. The storm reached its zenith at that exact moment, a final, deafening crack of thunder shaking the small house to its foundations. Then, an unnerving silence fell. The rain softened to a steady drumming. The thunder receded into a low grumble in the distance, and the wind died with a final, mournful sigh. It was into this sudden quiet that Elodie Thibodeau finally emerged from the bedroom. She moved slowly, her steps heavy and uncertain. Her face, usually a mask of calm professionalism, was ashen, drained of all color. In her arms, she cradled two tightly swaddled bundles. She did not look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the floorboards, as if she were afraid of what she might see if she looked up. Dr. Alistair Harlan arrived just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the Spanish moss. His buggy was caked in mud, his horse exhausted. He was a man of science, a recent graduate from a respectable northern college who had come south seeking to make a name for himself. He saw the parish not as a home, but as a collection of ailments to be conquered. The fevers, the agues, the myriad infections that thrived in the oppressive heat and damp. He was young, confident, and carried a leather bag filled with the latest medical instruments, a symbol of his belief in order and reason. He had a small, almost imperceptible scar on his chin from a childhood fall, a minor imperfection that somehow made his otherwise severe face seem more human. He entered the house with a brisk, no-nonsense air, nodding curtly at the pale-faced midwife. He spoke, asking her about the duration of the labor and the mother's condition. Elodie Thibodeau answered in a monotone, her voice flat and lifeless. She said only that the mother was resting and that the children had been delivered. Dr. Harlan placed his bag on a small wooden table and approached the two bundles that lay side by side in a makeshift crib. He was efficient, his movements precise and economical. He believed that observation was the cornerstone of medicine, that any mystery could be unraveled if one simply looked closely enough, with an unbiased eye. He gently unwrapped the first infant. It was a girl, perfectly formed, with a dusting of dark hair. He checked her breathing, her pulse, the color of her skin. Everything appeared normal, textbook even. He lifted her tiny eyelids to check the clarity of her eyes, a standard procedure. And then he stopped. He leaned in closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. The child's eyes were not clear. They were completely white, clouded over like milk quartz, the opaque orbs of someone who had been blind for 100 years. There was no iris, no pupil, only that uniform, unnerving whiteness. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a clinical curiosity. It was a severe congenital cataract, he reasoned, a rare but not impossible deformity. He carefully reswaddled the first child and turned his attention to the second. He expected to find the same condition, a tragic genetic flaw shared by twins. He unwrapped the second infant girl. She was identical to her sister in every way, from the shape of her face to the whirl of her dark hair. He lifted her eyelids, preparing himself for the milky white he had seen before. But the second child's eyes were the opposite. They were a void. Her pupils were so large they seemed to have consumed the iris entirely, leaving only two pools of perfect, unending blackness. They were like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing, absorbing all the light that entered them. The doctor stared, his scientific detachment beginning to crumble. It was not just the strangeness of the eyes, one white, one black. It was something else. As he watched, the first infant, the one with the white eyes, turned her head slightly to the left. At the exact same instant, with no discernible hesitation, the second infant, the one with the black eyes, mirrored the movement perfectly. It was not a coincidence. He watched, holding his breath. The first infant's tiny fist clenched. The second infant's fist clenched in perfect, fluid synchronicity. It was as if a single command was being issued to two separate bodies. He reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched the cheek of the white-eyed twin. She did not react. But across the crib, her black-eyed sister flinched, her tiny body recoiling as if she herself had been touched. Dr. Harlan snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. His face, moments before a mask of professional curiosity, was now pale with a dread that defied his medical training. This was not a deformity. This was not a genetic anomaly. This was something else, something for which his books and lectures had no name. He looked from the clouded white eyes to the endless black pupils, and he felt a coldness spread through him that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He saw an intelligence there, a shared consciousness that looked back at him from two bodies, seeing him in a way he could not comprehend. Without a word, he turned. He did not reswaddle the second child. He did not check on the mother. He did not speak to the midwife who stood watching him, her own fear reflected in his eyes. He walked directly to the table, snapped his leather bag shut, and left the house. He did not run. His movements were stiff, unnaturally controlled, the walk of a man trying desperately to contain a rising tide of panic. Elodie Thibodeau heard his buggy pull away, the sound of the horse's hooves frantic and hurried on the muddy track. She was left alone in the quiet house, with the sound of the fevered mother's shallow breathing and the two silent infants in the crib. The one with the white eyes seemed to stare at the ceiling, seeing nothing. The one with the black eyes seemed to stare into the room, seeing everything, and every few seconds they would blink, together, in perfect, silent unison. The story began to seep out of the Rousseau house like a fever. It did not travel in a straight line, but drifted on whispers and sideways glances. Elodie Thibodeau, a woman who had always been a source of comfort and gossip, became withdrawn and silent. When asked about the birth, she would only say that the mother was weak and the children were sickly. Her refusal to speak, however, spoke volumes. It created a vacuum that the parish was all too eager to fill with speculation. Dr. Harlan, for his part, refused to discuss the matter at all. He had left the Rousseau house and never returned. When members of the parish approached him about the infants, he claimed he had no recollection of the visit, that the storm must have confused the midwife. He said he had been attending to another patient on the other side of the parish. His denial was too vehement, too absolute. It was the lie of a man terrified of the truth. The whispers grew into a low, pervasive murmur that haunted the small community. They called them the unholy twins, the white-eyed and the black-eyed. Fishermen poling their skiffs through the murky backwaters would fall silent as they passed the Rousseau property. Trappers checking their lines would make wide detours around the small clapboard house. They said that at night, no lantern ever burned in the windows, yet a strange pale light sometimes seemed to emanate from within. They said the usual night sounds of the swamp, the chorus of frogs and insects, fell silent in the immediate vicinity of the house. The fear was an infection, spreading from family to family, isolating the fever-ridden mother and her two strange children. The parish priest visited once, intending to offer prayer and comfort. He stood on the porch for a full 5 minutes, his hand raised to knock, but he never did. He later told his wife that he felt a coldness coming from the house, a spiritual emptiness so profound it had stopped his hand. He said he felt as if he were standing at the edge of a great abyss. The rumors were fluid, changing with each telling. Some said the twins did not cry, but made a low, humming sound that could be heard on the wind. Others claimed they did not need to eat, that the mother grew weaker each day not from her fever, but because the infants were feeding on her life force directly. The stories traveled down the bayou, passed from one isolated settlement to the next, carried on flatboats and trading skiffs. They became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to frighten children. But like all persistent rumors, they contained a kernel of an impossible truth that would not be dismissed. Eventually, the stories traveled far enough downriver to reach the bustling, sophisticated port of New Orleans. They found their way into the salons and coffee houses, where men of science and philosophy gathered to debate the mysteries of the natural world. Most dismissed the tales as the superstitious ramblings of an uneducated backwater community, but the stories caught the attention of one man, a physician with a particular interest in the aberrations of nature. His name was Dr. Silas Renard, a man renowned for his investigations into phenomena that other men of science deemed unexplainable, and he decided he would travel upriver to see the unholy twins of St. Genevieve Parish for himself. The paddle steamer that carried Dr. Silas Renard upriver was named the Resolute. It was an irony that was not lost on him. The vessel itself was a testament to order and mechanical precision, its great wheel churning the muddy water with a rhythmic, predictable beat. But the world it moved through was anything but. The city of New Orleans, with its iron-lace balconies and cobblestone streets, fell away behind a curtain of cloying fog. It was a fog unique to that part of the world, not a clean coastal mist, but a heavy, wet blanket that smelled of silt and decay. It clung to the river, erasing the horizon and reducing the world to a claustrophobic circle of murky water and the oppressive, green walls of the bayou on either side. The journey was not measured in miles, but in a slow, suffocating passage of time. Dr. Silas Renard was a man who prided himself on his own resolute nature. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with a scholar's stoop to his shoulders. His face was narrow and intelligent, his eyes a pale, observant gray. He had a small, meticulous habit of constantly cleaning his spectacles with a silk cloth, a small ritual of clarity he performed whenever faced with a confusing problem. It was his one humanizing detail, an attempt to impose perfect vision on a world he knew was full of smudges and imperfections. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a collector of facts, a cataloger of the bizarre. His reputation in New Orleans was built on his willingness to investigate the cases other physicians dismissed as hysteria or outright fraud: the woman who wept tears of blood, the man who claimed to feel the pain of strangers. He approached each case with the same dispassionate skepticism, seeking the biological or psychological root of the seemingly supernatural. He believed that every ghost was a trick of the light, every curse a manifestation of fear. He did not believe in the unexplainable, only in the not yet explained. He kept a detailed journal of his journey, his handwriting a model of precision and clarity. In his early entries, he described the oppressive stillness of the swamp with a naturalist's eye. He noted the way the cypress trees rose from the black water, their branches draped in Spanish moss that looked like the gray hair of ancient, drowned giants. He wrote of the silence, a heavy, listening quiet that was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a silence that seemed to absorb the rhythmic churn of the paddle wheel, that muffled the shouts of the deckhands. It was, he wrote, a landscape that seemed to predate humanity, a place that was patient and watchful and utterly indifferent to the small, noisy vessel that trespassed upon its waters. He recorded the strange, fleeting shapes he saw in the fog, the sudden splash of an unseen creature, the mournful cry of a bird he could not identify. His notes were clinical, yet a current of unease ran beneath the surface of his precise language. He was a man of the city, a man of gaslight and reason, and this primal, featureless world was beginning to weigh upon him. When the Resolute finally reached the small, dilapidated landing that served St. Genevieve Parish, the fog had not lifted. It had thickened, pressing in from all sides. A handful of local men were there to meet the steamer, their faces grim and suspicious under the wide brims of their hats. They watched as Dr. Renner disembarked, his polished leather shoes a stark contrast to the sucking mud of the riverbank. He was an alien creature here, his city clothes and leather medical bag marking him as an outsider. He inquired about the Rousseau residence, and the men merely pointed, their gestures sullen and unwelcoming. One of them spoke, his voice a low drawl. He said that the doctor from the city was wasting his time. He said some things were best left alone. Renard simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and hired a boy with a mule cart to take him and his belongings inland. The journey from the landing to the house was a slow, arduous trek through a world of green and brown. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and jasmine, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask an underlying smell of stagnation. The cart wheels sank deep into the muddy track, and the mule strained with every step. The silence here was even more profound than on the river. The air did not move. The moss hung from the trees in absolute stillness. It felt to Renard as if he had entered a room where someone had just stopped breathing. He made an entry in his journal as the cart moved, his handwriting for the first time showing a slight tremor. He wrote that the very atmosphere of the place seemed to resist his presence. He felt a pressure in his ears, a heaviness in his limbs, as if the air itself were a physical weight. The Rousseau house appeared suddenly, a dark shape coalescing out of the mist. It was a small, desperate-looking structure, tilting slightly to one side as if it were slowly surrendering to the swamp that surrounded it. The wood was gray and unpainted, slick with a patina of green algae. A few skeletal chickens pecked listlessly in the yard. There was no smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows. It was a house that seemed to be holding its breath. As Renard approached the porch, the front door opened before he could knock. The midwife, Elodie Thibodeau, stood there. She was thinner than he had imagined from the stories, her face etched with a deep, weary resignation. She did not invite him in. She simply stood aside, her eyes not meeting his. She told him that the mother was sleeping, a fitful, feverish sleep that offered no rest. She said she had tried to care for the children, but it was a difficult thing. Dr. Renard stepped inside. The interior of the house was dark and smelled of sickness, wood smoke, and something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling. The single room was sparsely furnished, but it was the oppressive atmosphere that struck him most. It was the same unnatural stillness he had felt outside, but concentrated, amplified. It was a silence that felt ancient and knowing. Elodie Thibodeau gestured toward a small crib in the corner of the room, away from the weak light of the single window. She would not go near it. She remained by the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a silent, fearful sentry. She was his reluctant assistant, a guide who would lead him to the edge of the mystery but would go no further. With a deep breath, the kind a man takes before diving into cold water, Renard approached the crib. He set his leather bag down on the floor with a soft thud. He was a scientist entering his laboratory. He was an explorer approaching an unknown continent. He peered over the edge of the simple wooden frame, and he saw them. The two infant girls lay side by side, swaddled in clean but worn linen. They were not sleeping. They were staring directly up at him, their heads turned at the exact same angle, their gaze fixed upon his face. It was not the unfocused, wandering gaze of a newborn. It was a look of direct, unnerving, and seemingly unified awareness. For a long moment, Renard did nothing. He simply stood and looked, his mind racing to process the impossible sight. The rumors had not done it justice. The child on the left possessed eyes of a flat, uniform white, like polished marble. There was no pupil, no iris, just that opaque, clouded surface. The child on the right had eyes that were a perfect, absorbing black, twin voids that seemed to drink the dim light from the room. They were perfectly still. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths, but their limbs did not twitch. Their faces were placid, emotionless, and they stared at him, both of them. The effect was profoundly disorienting. It was like being watched by a single entity occupying two bodies, a single mind looking out through two sets of radically different eyes. Renard could feel a cold sweat prickle his neck. He forced himself to be methodical. He was Dr. Silas Renard. He was a man of science. He made a note in his mind of their identical physical features, the shared unnatural stillness. He had to separate fact from the fear that was beginning to coil in his gut. He decided to conduct a simple test of reflexes, a basic diagnostic procedure. He reached out his hand, slowly, deliberately, toward the infant on the right, the one with the black eyes. He intended to touch her hand, to see if she would grasp his finger. His fingers brushed against the back of her tiny hand. Her skin was cool, almost cold. The black eyes did not blink. Her expression did not change. She did not react in any way. But the other twin, the one with the white eyes, did. Her body went rigid. A tiny, silent gasp seemed to pass through her, a shudder that lasted for only a second. Her small hands, which had been lying placidly at her sides, clenched into tight fists. Renard froze, his hand still hovering over the black-eyed twin. He had not touched the white-eyed infant. She was a full foot away from him. There was no physical connection. It was impossible. He withdrew his hand slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched them. After a moment, the white-eyed twin's fists unclenched, her body relaxing back into its previous state of placid stillness. He had to be certain. He had to replicate the result. Science demanded it. He took a small, polished silver pin from his medical bag. His hand was not entirely steady. He reached toward the crib again, this time aiming for the child on the left, the one with the clouded white eyes. He hesitated for a moment, the silver point of the pin glinting in the gloom. He gently, so gently, touched the sole of her tiny foot with the pin. It was not enough to break the skin, just a firm, distinct pressure. The white-eyed infant remained completely still. She gave no sign that she had felt anything at all, but her sister, the one with the abyssal black eyes, reacted instantly. Her back arched. Her mouth opened in a silent cry, a perfect O of distress from which no sound emerged. And on the sole of her own foot, in the exact spot where he had touched her sister, a small, red mark began to bloom on the skin. Dr. Silas Renard stumbled back from the crib, a strangled noise caught in his throat. He looked from the mark on the one child's foot to the placid face of the other. His carefully constructed world of logic and reason was fracturing. This was not a medical condition. This was a violation of the fundamental laws of nature. Sensory information could not leap across empty space. A touch applied to one body could not manifest as a physical mark on another. He looked at the twins again. They were still staring at him, their expressions unchanged, their shared gaze seeming to strip away his layers of professional detachment, leaving him feeling naked and exposed. His initial intrigue had evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal unease. He felt like a man who had been carefully studying a strange new species of insect, only to have it turn and speak his name. He turned and saw Elodie Thibodeau still standing by the door. Her face was a mask of grim vindication. She had seen it too. She had lived with it. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She told him he should not be here. She said this was not an illness for him to cure. It was a curse for God to judge. Renard did not answer. He was already thinking, his mind trying to retreat into the familiar fortress of scientific process. He needed to understand. He needed to document. The fear was real, but his curiosity, his lifelong obsession with the unexplained, was stronger. He could not leave. To leave now would be to admit defeat, to concede that there were things in the world that his science could not touch. He looked back at the crib, at the impossible children who lay there. He told the midwife that he would be staying. He said he needed to perform a series of controlled observations over the next week. Elodie Thibodeau began to protest, her words a torrent of fear and warning, but Dr. Renard was no longer listening. He was already planning his experiments, his clinical mind reasserting control, even as a deep, cold part of him wished he had never come to this silent, waiting house. The first experiment began on the second day. Dr. Silas Renard approached the task with the grim determination of a man attempting to disprove a miracle. He was a scientist, and the bedrock of his world was the principle that an action could only have a reaction through direct, observable contact. What he had witnessed the day before was an affront to that principle, an impossibility that his mind refused to accept. He reasoned that there must be a trick, a subtle, undiscovered mechanism of communication between the infants. Perhaps they were sensitive to minute vibrations in the floorboards. Perhaps they communicated through a sound pitched too high for the human ear to detect. He would isolate them. He would eliminate every conceivable variable. He would find the rational explanation that he knew must be there. He spent the morning preparing the small, humid room as if it were a surgical theater in New Orleans. With Elodie Thibodeau watching in apprehensive silence, he moved the furniture. He placed the twins at opposite corners of the room, separated by a distance of nearly 15 feet. One lay in the crib. The other he placed carefully in a large, padded wicker basket that usually held laundry. He hung a heavy blanket from a ceiling beam, creating a thick curtain between them, a visual and acoustic barrier. The air in the room was stagnant, so thick with humidity you could feel it on your skin, a damp and heavy presence. Renard worked meticulously, his movements precise, a man imposing order on a chaotic environment. He cleaned his spectacles 3 times before he was satisfied that the stage was set. His goal was to test the auditory link, to see if a sound made to one would be perceived by the other. He chose the infant with the clouded white eyes as the subject. She was, in his estimation, the passive receiver, the one who seemed to exhibit no outward reaction to direct stimuli. He knelt beside her crib, his heart beating a steady, clinical rhythm. He looked into her milky, sightless eyes and felt a profound sense of dislocation. It was like looking at a beautiful, lifelike doll. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign of awareness. He leaned in close, his mouth just inches from her ear. The room was utterly silent save for the ragged, feverish breathing of Adeline Rousseau from the adjacent bedroom. Even the insects outside seemed to have ceased their constant thrumming. Renard chose his words carefully. He would whisper a single, uncommon word, something the child could not possibly have heard before. He spoke in French, a language he knew Elodie did not understand, a further layer of control. He whispered the word, equinox. The sound was a barely audible breath in the silent room. The white-eyed infant did not stir. Her expression remained a perfect, placid blank. For a moment, Renard felt a wave of relief. It was a failure. The connection had been a fluke, a trick of his own stressed and overstimulated mind. He had been a fool to be so shaken. He began to stand, a small, triumphant smile touching his lips. And then, from the other side of the room, from behind the heavy blanket, a sound came. It was a small, clear voice, the undeveloped voice of an infant, but it spoke with an impossible, chilling clarity. It spoke the word equinox. Renard froze, his body locked halfway between kneeling and standing. He stared at the blanket, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The voice had not come from the child he had spoken to. It had come from her sister, the one with the black, absorbing eyes, the one who was 15 feet away and separated by a thick woolen barrier. He slowly walked around the blanket, his steps leaden. The black-eyed twin was lying peacefully in the wicker basket. Her dark eyes were fixed on the ceiling. Her lips were slightly parted. She looked as if she had just woken from a pleasant dream. There was no way she could have heard him. The laws of acoustics made it impossible. He looked over at Elodie. The midwife had her back pressed against the far wall, her knuckles white where she gripped a small wooden cross that hung from her neck. Her eyes were wide with terror. She began to whisper a prayer, her voice a frantic, shaking litany of saints and angels. Renard did not hear her. He was staring at the infant in the basket, his scientific worldview crumbling into dust around him. The word had not been repeated. It had been answered. The second experiment took place that evening. The sun had set, and the swamp had plunged into a profound, suffocating darkness. A single lantern now provided the only light in the small house, casting long, grotesque shadows that writhed and danced on the walls. Renard felt a growing desperation. The auditory test had not brought clarity, only a deeper, more terrifying mystery. He had to push further. He had to find the limits of this impossible connection. He needed a physical, measurable result, something he could record in his journal, a piece of concrete evidence that could not be dismissed as a hallucination. He decided to test their shared sense of touch once more. But this time, he would seek not a reaction, but a physical manifestation. He would introduce a minor, controlled trauma. He sterilized a small steel lancet in the lantern's flame, the metal glowing orange in the gloom. His hand, he noted with a detached sense of alarm, was not entirely steady. He approached the twins, who now lay side by side in the crib once more. They watched him come, their strange, mismatched eyes following his every movement in perfect unison. He felt like an intruder, a clumsy dissector of something ancient and sacredly monstrous. He chose the infant with the black eyes. He took her tiny, delicate hand in his. Her skin was cool, almost waxy to the touch. He held the lancet poised over the tip of her index finger. He hesitated. A part of his mind, the physician's part, screamed at him. This was a violation of his oath. This was a needless infliction of pain upon a child. But another, colder part of him, the part that was a pure, relentless seeker of knowledge, insisted that it was necessary. He had to know. With a final, decisive movement, he pricked the child's finger. A single, perfect droplet of bright red blood welled up on the pale skin. The black-eyed infant did not cry. She did not even flinch. Her dark, fathomless eyes remained fixed on his face, her expression as serene and unreadable as ever. But her sister, the one with the clouded white eyes, reacted. A silent tremor passed through her small body. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was a pantomime of a scream. And then, the impossible happened. Renard, his gaze shifting from one child to the other, watched in stunned disbelief as a small, red mark appeared on the tip of the white-eyed twin's index finger. It was in the exact same spot he had pricked her sister. The skin was unbroken. There was no wound. But the flesh itself reddened, a small, circular stain that bloomed from within, a sympathetic wound, a stigmata of shared sensation. Renard dropped the lancet. It clattered onto the rough wooden floor. He stumbled back from the crib, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at his own hands, as if he no longer trusted them. He had crossed a line. This was no longer medicine. It was not science. It was something else, something that felt like a desecration. He looked at the twins, at the drop of blood on one finger and the bloodless wound on the other, and he felt a terror so profound it threatened to unmoor his sanity. They were not two separate beings who happened to share a strange connection. They were a single organism, a single field of sensation distributed across two bodies. To harm one was to harm the other. To touch one was to touch both. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, the orderly pages of his medical knowledge burning to ash in his mind. The true horror of the night was yet to come. Exhausted and emotionally shattered, Renard had fallen into a fitful sleep in a chair by the cold hearth. He was woken hours later by a sound that cut through the thick, humid darkness. It was a scream. It was not the silent, mimed cry of the infant, but a full-throated, soul-shredding shriek of pure terror. It came from the mother's room. Renard was on his feet in an instant, his physician's instincts taking over. He grabbed the lantern and rushed into the small bedroom. Adeline Rousseau was sitting bolt upright in her bed. Her eyes were wide and wild in the lantern light, fixed on some unseen horror in the corner of the room. Her body was rigid with fear, her hands clutching at the thin blanket. Her fever had spiked. Her skin was slick with a sheen of sweat that made her look like she had been drenched in water. Renard tried to soothe her. He spoke to her in a calm, steady voice, telling her she was safe, that it was only a dream. He reached out to feel her forehead, but she recoiled from his touch, scrambling away from him. She began to speak, her words a frantic, terrified torrent. She said she had heard them. She said they were in her head. She claimed to have woken to the sound of two voices, whispering to each other inside her own mind. It was not French, she said, not English, not the Cajun patois of the bayou. It was a language of clicks and whispers, a dry, sibilant tongue that felt older than the swamp itself. She said the voices were not the voices of children. They were cold, she insisted, and ancient, and they spoke of things that the living were not meant to know. She clutched her head, rocking back and forth, begging him to make them stop. Renard tried to dismiss it as a fever dream, a symptom of her deteriorating condition. But as he looked at her, at the genuine, primal terror in her eyes, a colder explanation began to form in his mind. The twins' connection was not a closed circuit. It was radiating outward. It was infecting their mother, leaking into her consciousness, a psychic poison that was driving her mad. The oppressive, silent presence he had felt in the house was not just his imagination. It was real. It was the psychic weight of the twins' shared mind, a mind that was now beginning to speak in a language of nightmares. The next morning, the outside world brought its own confirmation of the spreading wrongness. Elodie returned from a trip to the nearby settlement for supplies, her face grim. She told Renard that a local trapper had found his entire line of muskrat traps empty. That was not unusual. But what was unusual was that in the mud near each trap were the bodies of dozens of birds, marsh wrens and herons, all of them dead. Their necks were broken, but there were no signs of a predator. They had simply fallen from the sky. Later that day, a fisherman poled his skiff up to the landing near the Rousseau house. He refused to come ashore. He shouted from the water that a sickness had taken the fish in that part of the bayou. He said he had pulled up nets full of catfish and gar that were dead or dying, their bodies strangely rigid, their eyes wide with what he could only describe as terror. The experiments Renard was conducting inside the house, the methodical probing of the twins' unnatural bond, seemed to be creating ripples, disturbances that spread out into the surrounding swamp. The parish's suspicion that the twins were a curse was no longer a superstition. It was beginning to look like a horrifyingly accurate diagnosis. The land itself was growing sick, and its sickness was radiating from the two small, silent children in the clapboard house. The fear that had been a quiet, creeping vine in St. Genevieve Parish began to grow thorns. It moved from the shadowed corners of the community, from the hushed conversations on front porches and the wary glances exchanged over fishing nets, into the open air. The violent, inexplicable deaths of the local wildlife had acted as a catalyst, transforming a simmering, superstitious dread into a palpable, active hostility. The unnatural events were no longer just stories told about the Rousseau house. They were tangible evidence of a blight, a sickness that had taken root in their midst. The twins were no longer just a source of unsettling gossip. They were a threat. The fragile membrane of civility that held the isolated community together was beginning to tear, and the Rousseau family, along with the city doctor who had installed himself among them, were on the wrong side of that tear. The first open accusation came from a fisherman named Jean-Paul Boudreau, a large, weather-beaten man whose family had worked these waters for generations. He was a man who trusted the rhythms of the swamp more than he trusted any man, and those rhythms were now profoundly disturbed. He claimed, his voice loud and trembling with a mixture of fear and anger in the small trading post, that he had been poling his skiff home late one night, navigating by the faint starlight. As he passed the edge of the Rousseau property, a place he now avoided by habit, a strange stillness in the air had caught his attention. He looked toward the house and saw them. He swore on his father's grave that he saw the two infant girls standing in the muddy yard. They were not toddling or crawling like normal children. They were standing perfectly upright, their small forms silhouetted against the dark mass of the cypress trees. They held no lanterns, yet he could see them with an unnatural clarity, as if they were faintly illuminated from within. They were side by side, their heads turned toward the black, silent swamp, and they were staring intently into the darkness as if watching something that he could not see. He said their stillness was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. It was the stillness of a predator, patient and watchful. He pulled his skiff away as fast as he could, the sound of his own frantic heartbeat drowning out the night. His story spread like wildfire, carried by fear and amplified by each retelling. The image of the two infants standing unnaturally in the dead of night became a symbol for the community's mounting terror. It was a violation of the natural order, a sign that the evil they suspected was not contained within the walls of the house, but was now walking abroad. The fear, once formless, now had a face, or rather, two identical faces with mismatched, monstrous eyes. People began to act on that fear. Trappers who had once left small offerings of game on the Rousseau porch for the widowed mother now went out of their way to trample the path leading to her door. Women who had been friends with Adeline Rousseau now crossed themselves and turned away if they saw Elodie Thibodeau in the settlement. The house was no longer just an object of suspicion. It was becoming a shunned place, an island of contagion in the heart of the parish. The spiritual authority of the community, a stern, black-clad preacher named Reverend Michael Dubois, was compelled to act. He was a man who believed in a clear and simple division between good and evil, between the sacred and the profane. He saw the devil's hand in sickness, in crop failure, and most certainly in the unnatural tales that were now consuming his flock. He made it known that he would visit the Rousseau house himself, that he would confront this evil and cast it out with the power of his faith. His visit was a public event. A small, silent crowd of parishioners followed him at a distance, watching from the edge of the woods as he walked the muddy track to the small, gray house. They saw him walk onto the porch. They saw him raise his hand to knock on the door. And they saw him stop. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his hand frozen in midair, his head cocked as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Then, his face pale and his expression one of profound horror, he turned around and walked briskly away. He did not look back. He pushed through the crowd of onlookers, ignoring their questions, his eyes fixed on some distant, terrible horizon. He would later tell his wife, in a voice stripped of its usual booming certainty, that as he had stood on that porch, he had not felt the presence of a demon. He said it was far worse. He said he had felt an absolute and complete absence, a void where a soul should be, an emptiness so profound it had threatened to swallow his own faith whole. He refused to enter the house because he feared that if he did, the man who walked out would not be him. Reverend Dubois's failed exorcism was a turning point. If the man of God was afraid, then there was no hope for ordinary folk. The parish turned against the house and its occupants with a quiet, unified ferocity. The final thread of support, the midwife Elodie Thibodeau, finally snapped. She had been worn down by weeks of fear, sleepless nights, and the growing hostility of her neighbors. She had tried to help Dr. Renard, holding lanterns and fetching water, but his cold, methodical experiments terrified her. She saw them not as a search for knowledge, but as a deliberate provocation of a sleeping evil. The final straw was a nightmare. She told Renard, her voice shaking, that she had dreamed she was floating in a black, endless swamp under a sky with no stars. She could hear the two voices, the same clicking, whispering language the mother had described. In the dream, she knew what they were saying. They were discussing the precise and delicate mechanics of a human soul, speaking of it as if it were a machine they could dismantle and reassemble at will. She woke up screaming, the dream's cold logic clinging to her like a shroud. That morning, she packed her small bag of herbs and poultices, and she left. She did not say goodbye. She simply walked away from the house, her shoulders slumped in defeat, a woman fleeing a battle she knew she could not win. With Elodie gone, Dr. Renard was truly alone, trapped in the eye of a storm of his own making. The mother, Adeline Rousseau, had withdrawn completely. Her fever had not broken, and her mind had retreated to a place he could not reach. She spent her days in a state of near catatonia, staring at the ceiling, her lips sometimes moving in a silent, frantic prayer. But at night, her demeanor would change. She would become fiercely, animalistically protective of the twins. She seemed to see Renard not as a doctor, but as a threat, a tormentor. One evening, as he prepared to conduct another experiment, a test involving the twins' reaction to different colors of light, Adeline suddenly appeared in the doorway of her room. She had gotten out of bed for the first time in weeks. She was shockingly thin, a skeletal figure in a white nightgown, but her eyes burned with a feverish intensity. She spoke, her voice a low, guttural rasp that was barely human. She told him to get out. She said he would not touch her children again. She stood between him and the crib, her arms outstretched, a spectral guardian at the threshold of a profane sanctuary. Renard, for the first time, felt a prickle of physical fear. There was a strength in her that was not her own, a ferocity that seemed to spring from the same unnatural source as the twins' connection. He tried to reason with her, but she was beyond reason. He saw that to push the issue would be to invite a violence he was not prepared for. He retreated, leaving the room to the mother and her silent, watchful children. His frustration was immense. He was a man of science, and he had been defeated by what he could only describe as a primitive, superstitious rage. He was on the verge of a discovery that could reshape humanity's understanding of consciousness, but he was being blocked by the very subjects of his study. He could not stay in the house, where the atmosphere was becoming more poisonous by the day, a mixture of sickness, madness, and the twins' oppressive psychic presence. The parish was now openly hostile, and his supplies were running low. He was isolated, his resolve beginning to fray. His journal entries from this time reflect his growing desperation. His once neat, precise handwriting became jagged and erratic. He wrote of the constant, oppressive silence, of the feeling of being watched not just by the twins, but by the house itself, by the swamp that surrounded it. He felt his own mind beginning to slip, his scientific objectivity clouded by the mounting, inexplicable evidence and the suffocating fear. He made a decision. It was a drastic, unethical, and dangerous choice, but he saw it as his only option. He could not continue his studies here. He had to remove the twins from this environment. He had to take them to a controlled setting, back to New Orleans, where he had colleagues and equipment, where he could subject them to a more rigorous, systematic analysis away from the corrupting influence of the bayou and their deteriorating mother. He knew he could not take them openly. The parish would never allow it. They would see it as him attempting to carry their curse downriver, to spread the contagion. It would have to be done in secret, under the cover of darkness. He began to make his arrangements, sending a message with a traveling merchant to a contact in New Orleans, a riverboat captain who owed him a favor and was not inclined to ask questions. He would arrange for the secret transport of two very special children. He felt a pang of guilt about their mother, about stealing her children from her, but he rationalized it. He told himself it was a medical necessity. He told himself he was saving the twins from the ignorance and violence of the parish. But deep down, he knew he was also saving himself. He was running from the oppressive madness of the house, from the weight of what he had discovered, and he was taking the source of that madness with him. The escape from St. Genevieve Parish was an act of quiet desperation, executed in the suffocating blackness of a moonless night. Dr. Silas Renard moved with the furtive urgency of a thief, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had bribed a local boy with a silver dollar, a small fortune in that impoverished place, to create a distraction at the far end of the settlement, a fire set with damp kindling that would produce more smoke than flame, just enough to draw the attention of the perpetually wary parishioners. Under the cover of this diversion, Renard stole into the Rousseau house. Adeline Rousseau was in one of her deep, catatonic states, her breathing shallow, oblivious to the world. A part of Renard felt a profound, stabbing guilt as he lifted the two silent infants from their shared crib. They were unnervingly still in his arms, their strange, mismatched eyes wide open in the darkness, watching him without judgment or fear. He wrapped them in heavy blankets, concealing them in two separate wicker baskets, and carried them out into the humid night. The journey to the secret landing point, a place a mile downriver from the main settlement, was a nightmare of sucking mud and grasping thorns. The oppressive silence of the swamp seemed to magnify every sound, the snap of a twig, the panicked splash of a frog, his own ragged breathing. He felt as if the entire bayou was watching his transgression, a silent, disapproving witness to his desperate act of scientific abduction. The riverboat was a small, grimy steamer named the Black Heron, a vessel that usually transported cotton and illicit goods. Its captain, a man whose loyalty was to coin, not conscience. As Renard handed the two baskets up to a waiting deckhand, a thick, unnatural fog began to roll in from the river, swallowing the flickering lanterns of the boat and muffling all sound. It was the same cloying, sentient fog that had greeted him on his arrival, and its return felt like an omen, a sign that he was not escaping the influence of the parish, but merely carrying its heart with him down the river. The steamer pulled away from the bank with a low groan of stressed wood and churning water, disappearing into the mist, leaving the haunted parish behind in the darkness. Reynard, standing on the narrow deck, looked back into the impenetrable blackness, and for a moment he thought he heard a woman's cry, a thin, desolate wail of loss carried on the damp air. He told himself it was just the wind, or a night bird. He had to believe it was the wind. The journey downriver was not a return to the world of reason and order he had been so desperate to find. Instead, it became a slow, suffocating descent into a floating microcosm of the very madness he was fleeing. The presence of the twins, hidden away in a small, windowless cabin in the stern, began to assert itself almost immediately. The other passengers, a rough collection of gamblers, merchants, and a single, sober-suited family, grew restless and irritable. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. A card game ended in a bloody fistfight. The atmosphere on the small vessel grew tense and paranoid, as if a fever of the mind were slowly spreading from person to person. They knew nothing of the boat's secret cargo, yet they felt it, a subtle pressure, a wrongness that soured the air and frayed their nerves. By the second day, a more specific and terrifying phenomenon began to take hold. Passengers began to report dreams. A portly cotton merchant, his face pale and beaded with sweat, confided to the captain that he had woken in terror from a nightmare of drowning in thick black mud, his lungs filling with silt as unseen things writhed around his legs. Later that day, the mother of the traveling family, a quiet, religious woman, approached Renard, mistaking him for a man of the cloth. She spoke in a hushed, frantic whisper of a terrible dream. She had dreamed she was trapped at the bottom of a dark river, unable to breathe, the weight of the water crushing her as skeletal, moss-covered trees reached for her from the banks. The dreams were all identical. They were not just similar, they were the same, down to the smallest, most terrifying details. A collective nightmare had seized the boat, a shared vision of a slow, suffocating death in the black water of the swamp. The twins, sleeping silently in their cabin, were dreaming, and their dreams were leaking out, infecting the minds of everyone on board. The crew, a small, superstitious lot of rivermen, began to avoid the stern of the boat. They had seen Renard carry the baskets aboard, and though they did not know what was inside, they sensed the unnatural coldness that emanated from that small cabin. They made the sign against the evil eye as they passed the door. One of the deckhands swore that at night he could hear a sound coming from within, not the crying of infants, but a low, soft humming noise. A sound, he said, was like the vibration of the earth itself. The boat's lamps, usually a bright, steady beacon in the river's darkness, seemed to dim and flicker whenever the steamer passed a particularly dense and ancient-looking stretch of cypress swamp. The engineer, a man who knew the boat's engine like his own heart, could find no explanation. The pressure was steady, the fuel lines were clear, yet the light faltered, starved by some invisible, energy-draining presence. A strange sickness also began to afflict the few animals on board, a small collection of chickens and a pig kept in a pen on the lower deck. They became lethargic, refusing to eat. Then, a sudden violent fever took them. Their bodies trembled, their eyes rolled back in their heads, and within hours, they were all dead. There were no marks on their bodies, no signs of conventional disease. They had simply died, as if their life force had been siphoned away. The crew, already on edge, saw it as a final, undeniable sign. They said the boat was cursed. They said the city doctor had brought a powerful grizz on board, a dark magic that was poisoning the vessel. Throughout this slow, unfolding nightmare, Dr. Renard remained locked in the cabin with the twins, a prisoner of his own experiment. He was keeping detailed notes, his journal now, his only anchor to the rational world he felt slipping away from him. But the entries themselves were a testament to his deteriorating state. His precise, clinical handwriting grew increasingly erratic, devolving into a spidery, almost illegible scrawl that slanted across the page. He documented the passengers' dreams, the dimming lights, the dying livestock. He tried to frame it all in scientific terms, speculating about atmospheric pressure, mass hysteria, and unknown pathogens. But his words were hollow, the desperate rationalizations of a man confronting a reality that his science could not explain. He was no longer an objective observer. He was a participant, caught in the epicenter of the phenomenon. He spent hours just watching the twins. They rarely slept, or at least, their form of sleep was not something he could recognize. They would lie for hours, perfectly still, their eyes open and fixed on the low wooden ceiling of the cabin. It was during these times that the disturbances on the boat were at their most intense. He became convinced that their shared consciousness was projecting outward, touching the minds of those around them, subtly altering the physical world to match its own alien nature. He tried to conduct his experiments, but his hands shook too badly. He attempted to whisper another word in French to the white-eyed twin, but his throat was too dry, his nerve gone. He had become terrified of them, of what they were, of what they were capable of. He was no longer in control of the experiment. He, and everyone else on the Black Heron, was now a part of it. His journal entries became less scientific and more philosophical, more fearful. He wrote, "I brought them onto this boat believing I was transporting a curiosity, a medical anomaly. I see now I was wrong. I have not captured them. They have captured me. We are not traveling downriver to New Orleans. We are adrift in a small, floating piece of their world, a world that does not adhere to the laws of ours. The very air, the light, the dreams of men, all are subject to their silent, unified will. I fear I have not brought a discovery to the world of science. I fear I have unleashed a sickness upon it." As the Black Heron neared the sprawling, chaotic port of New Orleans, a new and terrible piece of news reached them. A quarantine boat, flying the ominous yellow flag, motored out to meet them. A man with a megaphone shouted across the water. He said a virulent strain of yellow fever had broken out in the city. The port was sealed. No one was allowed to enter or leave. The quarantine was absolute. For Renard, the news was a devastating blow. His plan was in ruins. He could not take the twins to his laboratory. He could not consult with his colleagues. He was trapped. The captain of the Black Heron, anxious to be rid of his cursed cargo and the city doctor, made a hurried, clandestine arrangement. He knew a place, a shuttered and abandoned cotton warehouse on a derelict stretch of the docks, a place where Renard could hide with the children until the quarantine was lifted. It was a desperate, dangerous solution, but it was the only one. That night, under the cover of another thick, unnatural fog, Dr. Silas Renard and his 2 silent charges were put ashore, disappearing into the labyrinthine, plague-stricken alleys of the New Orleans waterfront, trading the claustrophobia of the riverboat for the claustrophobia of a city in the grip of death. The warehouse was a cavern of dust and shadows, a tomb for the ghosts of commerce. It stood among a row of derelict buildings on the waterfront, its windows boarded over, its heavy doors sealed with rust and time. The air inside was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smells of rat droppings, decaying jute, and the faint, sweet, cloying scent of the yellow fever that now haunted the city outside. Through the cracks in the boarded windows, thin slivers of gray light pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust, the only sign of movement in the cavernous space. The sounds of the quarantined city were a constant, muffled backdrop to the silence within. The distant, mournful tolling of church bells, marking another death, the rumble of cartwheels carrying the dead, the faint, panicked shouts of men trying to enforce an order that was collapsing into chaos. For Dr. Silas Renard, this forgotten, rotting space was now his laboratory, his sanctuary, and his prison. He and the twins were utterly alone, sealed in a pocket of profound silence while a city died around them. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. Renard had secured a few meager supplies before the quarantine had fully tightened its grip: a cask of fresh water, a bag of dried beans, a handful of tallow candles. He made a small, crude living space for himself in a corner of the vast, empty floor, and he fashioned a new crib for the twins from a set of old, splintered packing crates. He was a man shipwrecked, a castaway on an island of decay. His scientific ambition had curdled into a grim, obsessive need to simply survive and to document the final act of this impossible story. He had lost a significant amount of weight. His clothes, once the immaculate attire of a city physician, were now filthy and tattered. A feverish, hunted look was in his eyes, the look of a man who has stared too long into an abyss and has felt it staring back. His hands trembled almost constantly, and his journal, the last bastion of his former self, was now filled with a scrawled, near incoherent record of his descent. The twins themselves seemed utterly unaffected by their new surroundings. They were as placid and still in the dusty, shadow-filled warehouse as they had been in the humid air of the bayou or the cramped cabin of the riverboat. They lay side by side in their makeshift crib, their mismatched eyes watching the dance of the dust motes in the slivers of light. They never cried. They took the small amounts of watered-down milk he gave them without protest, without any sign of hunger or satisfaction. Their presence filled the vast emptiness of the warehouse. It was a silence that was heavier and more profound than a simple absence of sound. It was a living silence, an ancient, watchful quiet that seemed to press in on Renard from all sides, making it difficult to breathe, making it impossible to think clearly. His own thoughts no longer felt entirely his own. They were slow and viscous, and sometimes he would hear a faint, high-pitched hum at the very edge of his hearing, a sound like a distant, vibrating string, and he would wonder if it was the sound of their consciousness, the baseline frequency of their shared mind. He knew he had to conduct one final observation. His time was running out. His supplies were dwindling, and the fever was spreading through the city with terrifying speed. He could feel a strange lethargy in his own limbs, a telltale ache behind his eyes that he recognized with a physician's dread. He had to attempt one last, definitive experiment, one final effort to provoke a reaction that would give him a clue, any clue, as to the nature of their existence. He planned it for the pre-dawn hours of the third day, a time when the city's death toll seemed to quiet, a brief, exhausted lull before the sun rose on another day of misery. His final experiment was to be one of sensory overload. He would confront them not with a single, subtle stimulus, but with a barrage of them. He would test light, touch, and sound all at once in a final, desperate attempt to breach the walls of their serene, impenetrable world. He gathered his meager tools. He had one candle left, a small shard of polished mirror he had found on the floor, and the steel lancet from his medical bag. He waited until the darkness was at its absolute deepest, a thick, velvety blackness that felt as if it had weight and texture. He lit the candle, its small, wavering flame creating a tiny circle of light in the immense darkness, a fragile island of reason in an ocean of the unknown. He approached the crib, his shadow a looming, monstrous giant thrown against the far wall. The twins were awake, as always. They were not lying down. They were sitting perfectly upright, facing each other, their small forms silhouetted against the candlelight. They were so still they looked like porcelain dolls, a perfectly mirrored pair, one with eyes that drank the light, the other with eyes that seemed to be a source of their own pale internal luminescence. Renard held his breath. He had never seen them sit up on their own before. He held the candle aloft. The light washed over them. They did not react. He moved the flame back and forth, casting flickering shadows across their faces. There was no change in their expression, no flicker of their eyelids. He held the shard of mirror up, trying to catch their gaze, to see if they would react to their own reflection. The mirror showed him only his own haggard, terrified face and the two small, still figures. The black-eyed twins' reflection was a void, and the white-eyed twins' reflection seemed to glow with a faint, ghostly light of its own. He spoke to them, his voice a dry, cracking whisper. He spoke their mother's name. He spoke of the bayou. He spoke of the riverboat. He shouted. His voice echoed in the vast, empty space, a desperate, lonely sound. They did not move. Their silence was absolute, a perfect, unyielding wall. Finally, with a trembling hand, he took the lancet. He would test their shared sensation one last time. He reached out and touched the back of the white-eyed twin's hand. He pressed the point of the lancet against her skin, harder this time, a sharp, undeniable pain. She did not move. He looked at her sister. There was no recoil, no sympathetic mark appearing on her skin. The connection was broken. The link, the impossible, terrifying bridge between their bodies, had been severed. They were separate. They were just two small, unnaturally still children, sitting in a box in a dark and dusty room. The phenomenon was over. But in that ending, Renard felt a new and even more profound terror. The silence that followed was different. It was not the watchful, living silence he had grown accustomed to. It was an empty, dead silence. The silence of a vacuum. It was the silence of a profound and absolute absence. Outside, the city bells began to toll, a slow, steady, overlapping chorus of iron and grief. The sun was rising, and the city was counting its dead. Renard stood frozen, the lancet in his hand, staring at the two unmoving figures. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of dizziness. The ache behind his eyes exploded into a throbbing pain. The floor of the warehouse seemed to tilt and sway beneath his feet. He dropped the lancet and stumbled back, his last candle falling and extinguishing itself on the damp floor, plunging the warehouse into near-total darkness. He collapsed, his last conscious sensation the cold, hard feel of the dusty floorboards against his cheek and the relentless, deafening tolling of the bells. Dock workers, assigned the grim task of clearing bodies from the waterfront, broke down the warehouse doors at midday. They were searching for the vagrants who often took shelter in the abandoned buildings, victims of the fever who had crawled away to die alone. They found Dr. Silas Renard unconscious on the floor, surrounded by pages of scattered, frantically written notes. He was alive, but barely, burning with the high fever of the plague. Of the twins, there was no sign. The makeshift crib was empty. The workers searched the entire warehouse, a vast, echoing space with only one sealed entrance, the one they had just broken down. They found nothing. There was no way out, no other doors, no windows large enough for a person to pass through. Witnesses from the adjacent buildings and the street were questioned. They were adamant. No one, not a soul, had been seen entering or leaving the warehouse all night. The twins were gone. They had vanished from a sealed room, leaving behind only an unconscious, dying man and his mad scribblings. Dr. Silas Renard did not die. He survived the yellow fever, though it left him a broken, haunted man. He never practiced medicine again. He spent the rest of his short life in a sanatorium, a place for the wealthy and mentally frail, where he would sit for hours, staring into space, sometimes muttering to himself about a river and two sets of eyes. Most of his journal was lost or destroyed, dismissed as the incoherent ramblings of a fever-addled mind. But one page survived, tucked into the case file of his committal. It was the last page he had written, scrawled in the final moments of his lucidity in the darkness of the warehouse. The handwriting is almost a child's scrawl, the words jagged and desperate. But the final entry is clear. It is a single, chilling sentence, a final, impossible revelation from a man who had looked into the abyss and had seen the truth. The page reads, simply, "Not two." The case file on the unholy twins of Saint Genevieve is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, subscribe to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.